Senator Dayton.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I also want to commend you for holding this hearing and swift response to the 9/11 Commission's report. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I want to say again to you that we are all indebted to you and to the other 8 members of your commission and your staff for this critically important work that you've provided the nation. It is a profoundly disturbing report because it chronicles in excruciating detail the terrible attack against our homeland, the despicable murder of so many American citizens, and the horrible destruction to countless other lives and liberties throughout this nation. And because of the utter failure to defend them by their federal government, by their leaders and the institutions that were entrusted to do so, and because of serious discrepancies between the facts that you've set forth and what was told to the American people, the members of Congress, and to your own commission by some of those authorities. There's way too much to cover here, but I will begin. According to your report, the first of the 4 airliner hijackings occurred on September 11th at 8:14 a.m. Eastern Time. At 10:03 a.m., almost 2 hours later, an hour and 49 minutes to be exact, the 4th and last plane crashed before reaching its intended target, the U.S. Capitol, because of the incredible heroism of its passengers, including Minnesota native Thomas Burnett, Jr. During those entire 109 minutes, to my reading of your report, this country and its citizens were completely undefended. Yes, it was a surprise attack. It was unprecedented. Yes, it exposed serious flaws, and as you've noted, our imaginations, our policies, capabilities, and management designs. But what I find much more shocking and alarming were the repeated and catastrophic failures of the leaders in charge and the other people responsible to do their jobs, to follow established procedures, to follow direct orders from civilian and military commanders. And then they failed to tell us the truth later. It doesn't matter whether they were Republicans, Democrats, or neither. It matters what they did or did not do. According to your findings, FAA authorities failed to inform the military command, NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, about 3 of the 4 hijackings until after the planes had crashed into their targets at the Second World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the ground in Pennsylvania, which was not their target. The direct FAA notification of the military occurred regarding the first plane, 23 minutes after it was hijacked and only 9 minutes before it struck the first World Trade Tower. NORAD then scrambled one of only 2 sets of fighter planes on alert in the entire eastern third of the country, one in Massachusetts, one in Virginia, but it didn't know where to send them because the hijackers had turned off the plane's transponder, so NORAD couldn't locate it on their radar. And they're still looking for it when it exploded into its target at 8:46 a.m. The second hijacking began, according to your report, 1 minute later. NORAD wasn't notified until the same minute that the plane struck the second World Trade Tower. And it was 5 more minutes before NORAD's mission commander learned about that explosion, which was 5 minutes after thousands of Americans saw it on live television. By this time, the third plane's transponder was off. Communication had been severed. Yet it was 15 minutes before the flight controller decided to notify the regional FAA center, which in turn did not inform FAA headquarters for another 15 minutes. So at that point, 9:25 a.m., FAA's National Command Center knew that there were 2 hijacked planes that had crashed into the 2 World Trade Centers, and a third plane had stopped communicating and disappeared from its primary radar, yet no one at the FAA headquarters asked for military assistance with that plane either. NORAD was unaware that the plane had even been hijacked until after it crashed into the Pentagon at 9:34. This is just unbelievable negligence. It doesn't matter if we spend $550 billion annually on our national defense, if we reorganize our intelligence, or if we restructure congressional oversight, if people don't pick up a phone to call one another, if we're not told that somebody needs a new radar system or doesn't install it when it's provided. And this was not an occasional human error or failure. This was nothing but human error and failure to follow established procedures and to use common sense. And unfortunately, the chronicle is not over. NORAD Mission Commander ordered his only 3 other planes, on alert in Virginia to scramble and fly north to Baltimore. Minutes later, when he was told that a plane was approaching Washington, he learned that the planes were flying east over the Atlantic Ocean, away from Baltimore and Washington. So that when the third plane struck the Pentagon, NORAD's fighters were 150 miles away, farther than they were before they took off. By then, FAA's command center had learned of the fourth hijacking and called FAA headquarters, specifically asking it to contact the military at 9:36 a.m. And at 9:46 a.m., the FAA command center updated FAA headquarters that United Flight 93 was, quote, now 29 minutes out of Washington, D.C. 3 minutes later, your document records this following conversation, the FAA command center to the headquarters. Command center, do we want to think about scrambling aircraft? FAA headquarters, oh God, I don't know. Command center, that's a decision somebody's going to have to make probably in the next 10 minutes. FAA headquarters, yeah, you know, everybody just left the room. At 10:03, United Flight 93 crashed into Pennsylvania farm soil, and nobody from the FAA headquarters had contacted the military. NORAD didn't know that this fourth plane was hijacked until after it crashed 35 minutes later. The fighter planes had reached Washington 7 minutes after that crash, and they were told by the mission commander, negative clearance to shoot the aircraft over the nation's capital. Yet 1 week after 9/11, in response to initial reports that the military failed to defend our domestic airspace during the hijacks, NORAD issued an official chronology which stated that the FAA notified NORAD of the second hijacking at 8:43. Wrong. FAA notified NORAD of the third hijacking at 9:24, according to your report. Wrong. FAA notified NORAD of the fourth hijacking at an unspecified time, and that prior to the crash in Pennsylvania, Langley F-16 combat air patrol planes were in place, remaining in place to protect Washington, D.C. All untrue. In public testimony before your 9/11 Commission in May of 2003, NORAD officials stated, I assume under oath, that at 9:16 they had received the hijack notification of United Flight 93 from the FAA. That hijacking did not occur until 9:28. There was a routine cockpit transmission recovered at 9:27. And in that testimony before you, NORAD officials stated also that at 9:24 they received notice of the hijacking of the third plane, American Flight 77. Also untrue according to your report, which states that NORAD was never notified that that flight was hijacked. NORAD officials testified that they scrambled the Langley, Virginia fighters to respond to those two hijackings, yet tape recordings of both NORAD and FAA both reportedly documented that the order to scramble was in response to an inaccurate FAA report that American Flight 11 had not hit the first World Trade Tower and was headed to Washington. That erroneous alert was transmitted by the FAA at 9:24 a.m., 38 minutes after that airplane had exploded into the World Trade Tower. Yet NORAD's public chronology on 9/18/01 and their commission testimony 20 months later covered up those truths. They lied to the American people, they lied to Congress, and they lied to your 9/11 Commission to create a false impression of competence, communication, coordination, and protection of the American people. And we can set up all of the oversight possible at great additional cost to the American taxpayers, and it won't be worth an Enron pension if the people responsible lie to us. If they take their records and doctor them into falsehoods, and if they get away with it. Because for almost 3 years now, NORAD officials and FAA officials have been able to hide their critical failures that left this country defenseless during two of the worst hours in our history. And I believe that President Bush must call those responsible for those representations to account. If the Commission's accounts are correct, he should fire whoever at FAA, at NORAD, or anywhere else betrayed their public trust by not telling us the truth. And then he should clear up a few discrepancies of his own. 4 months after September 11th, on January 27th, 2002, the Washington Post, Dan Balls and Bob Woodward authored an insider's retrospective on top administration officials' actions on 9/11 and thereafter. They reported that very shortly after the Pentagon was struck at 9:34, quote, Pentagon officials ordered up the airborne command post used only in national emergencies. They sent up combat air patrol in the Washington area and a fighter escort for Air Force One. Secretary Rumsfeld was portrayed as, quote, taking up his post in the National Military Command Center, and all of that reportedly occurred before 9:55 a.m. Right thereafter, quote, Bush then talked to Rumsfeld to clarify the procedures military pilots should follow before firing on attack planes. With Bush's approval, Rumsfeld passed the order down the chain of command, close quote. This was supposedly taking place, according to that article, before the fourth plane crashed in Pennsylvania at 10:03. Looks very impressive. The President's acting swiftly and decisively, giving orders to the Secretary of Defense and on down the chain of command. Combat air patrol planes are patrolling Washington, directed by an airborne command post, all before 10:03 a.m. However, according to your commission, President Bush spoke to Secretary Rumsfeld for the first time that morning, shortly after 10 a.m. Based on White House notes and Ari Fleischer notes of the conversation, the Commission's report states that it was a brief call in which the subject of shoot-down authority was not discussed. The Commission then states that the Secretary of Defense did not join the National Military Command Center's conference call until just before 10:30 a.m. The Secretary himself told the Commission he was just gaining situational awareness when he spoke with the Vice President at 10:39 a.m. That transcript is on page 43. My time is out, but it reflects the Vice President's honest, mistakenly belief that he had given an order after talking with the President to shoot down any plane that would not divert. Yet incredibly, the NORAD commander, I'm just going to finish this if I may. Yet incredibly, the NORAD commander did not pass that order on to the fighter planes because he was, quote, unsure how the pilots would or should proceed with this guidance. As you say, Mr. Co-Chairman, the situation is urgent when we don't get protected in those circumstances, and it's even worse when it's covered up. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Dayton.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to join with others in thanking you for your extensive and exhaustive work. It's been a great service to all of us and your country. Thank you very much. I want to go back to some of the events that you chronicle in the report on September 11th itself, and some of the discrepancies, particularly involving NORAD. A week after 9/11, NORAD issued a public chronology in response to some of the initial reports that they had failed to defend our domestic airspace during the hijackings. And their chronology, again, dated September 18th, 2001, stated that the FAA notified NORAD of the second hijacking at 8:43 a.m., that FAA notified NORAD of the third hijacking at 9:24, that FAA notified NORAD of the fourth hijacking at an unspecified time, that prior to the crash in Pennsylvania, Langley F-16 Civil Air Patrol is a quote, Langley F-16 Civil Combat Air Patrol remains in place to protect D.C. And then in public testimony before your commission on May of 2003, NORAD officials stated, and I don't know whether this was under oath or not, but at 9:16 they received hijack notification of United 93 from the FAA. Your report notes that that hijacking did not actually occur until 9:28 a.m., 12 minutes after they said they received that notification. In that testimony, also before your commission, NORAD officials stated that at 9:24 they received notice of the hijacking of the third plane, American Flight 77, which your commission's report also states is untrue, that NORAD was never notified that that plane was hijacked. And they also testified before your commission that they scrambled the Langley, Virginia fighters to respond to those two hijackings, yet the tape remarks, according to your report, at both NORAD and FAA reportedly documented that that order to scramble was in response to an inaccurate FAA report that American Flight 11 had not hit the First World Trade Tower and was headed to Washington. And your report notes that that erroneous alert was transmitted by the FAA at 9:24 a.m., 38 minutes after American Flight 11 had in fact exploded into the World Trade Tower. Can you give me any way to reconcile their stated versions and yours?
No, sir. We addressed that directly on pages 31 and 34 of the Commission report. We did, more or less as you have just done, contrasted NORAD and FAA prior statements with the conclusions the Commission has reached. As you may know, sir, in public testimony, which was sworn, officials of both NORAD and FAA have acknowledged that the Commission's account of these facts is accurate and their prior accounts were indeed incorrect.
Did they explain why, how it is that they came to recognize the veracity of yours and the inaccuracy of their own?
Sir, we all regard it as a learning process, and I think further questions about the learning process at their end are directed to those agencies.
Thank you. Also, there were various reports based on sources that shortly after 9/11 that stated that very shortly after the Pentagon was struck at 9:34, quote, Pentagon officials ordered up the airborne command post, use only in national emergencies. There's another reference in another article to AWACS plane being sent up at about that time. Are you aware of an AWACS or airborne command post being sent aloft at that? This is again about between 9:35 and 10 a.m. Because your report doesn't mention one.
No, sir. The aircraft you're referring to has to do with continuity of government issues that we chose not to discuss in the report for reasons of classification. We are, however, aware of the aircraft movements you refer to and tracked the movements of that and other relevant aircraft completely. If they had borne in any material way on the 9/11 story, we would have discussed it in our report.
All right. So is the implication that they're aloft and we're organizing a air defense of the United States at that point in time, domestic air defense? Is that?
No, sir. That aircraft had nothing to do with organizing American air defense and played no part whatever in the command and control issues that NORAD faced that morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I join with the others in thanking you for convening this and tomorrow's hearings. And gentlemen, thank you for your appearance and your service. I want to focus on a different set of failures that were disclosed in the 9/11 Commission report, which were the failures to, as I read it, follow some of the existing protocols and procedures and thereby the failure to respond to the actual attack on 9/11, and given especially your experience at the very top of the civilian chain of command, I'd just like to see whether what strikes me as some egregious disconnects were in fact what I perceive them to be, because we talk about this need for fundamental reorganization or reform and these different words at these levels of sophisticated intelligence gathering, coordination, et cetera, which I don't dispute. I've spent now swearing in another committee in this afternoon, about 6 hours well spent on these various aspects. But according to the Commission report, at least 2 and probably 3 orders from the Vice President of the United States through a military aide to NORAD to communicate to the fighter planes that were in the air at that time, the authority to shoot down an incoming enemy plane, a hijacked plane, were not passed on to the fighter pilots by the mission commander. On page 83, both the NORAD mission commander and the senior weapons director indicated they did not pass the order to the fighters circling Washington, New York, because they were unsure how the pilots would or should proceed with this guidance. Leaving aside that this authorization from the Vice President, based on, as he communicated, his conversation with the President occurred 2 hours after the first hijacking began and 10 minutes after the last plane actually had crashed in the fields of Pennsylvania. The fact that it was not passed on by NORAD to the pilots, to me, just is astonishing, The commission goes on in the next paragraph to say, in most cases, quote, in most cases, the chain of command authorizing the use of force runs from the President to the Secretary of Defense and from the Secretary to the combatant commander. The President apparently spoke to Secretary Rumsfeld for the first time that morning shortly after 10 o'clock. No one can recall the content of this conversation, but it was a brief call in which the subject of shoot-down authority was not discussed. Then the Secretary of Defense, who I give full credit for going courageously to the site of the Pentagon explosion, is returned at 10:39. This is 2.5 hours now after almost 2 hours and 25 minutes after the first hijacking commenced. And the Vice President is understandably of the belief that he's passed on these orders and that they're being carried out. And the Secretary of Defense, seems to me very appropriately is saying, who did you give the direction to? And the Secretary of Defense, has that directive been transmitted to the aircraft? Vice President, yes, it has. Secretary of Defense, just to be clear. So we've got a couple of aircraft up there that have those instructions at the present time. Vice President, that is correct. It's my understanding they've already taken a couple of aircraft out. Now, if you were the Secretary of Defense in this kind of situation and that order from the Vice President of the United States transmitted in that way to the defense of this country has not been communicated to the pilots up there, is that an acceptable procedure, or is that as egregious a failure to defend this country as it appears to me?
Certainly not acceptable. The defense never trained for this kind of circumstance.
Well, but
that's no excuse. But that's a fact.
they trained to follow out the command. I mean, that's what I'm trying to understand. Is there a failure to establish the proper chain of command? If the Secretary of Defense had given a command from the President of the United States, would that have been carried out without question? Or in this case, given that it came from the Vice President, based on a verbal conversation with the President, who's up on Air Force One, understandably, I mean, is up there and by his own testimony is having difficulty with the communication system there, which is another concern, to communicate on an ongoing line of communication with the Vice President. The Vice President transmits an order for instruction from the President to NORAD, and it's not passed on. I mean, where's the breakdown here? Just because it hasn't been rehearsed?
I can't answer that.
No, I mean, is it? I mean,
Well,
I'm astonished.
Sir, I'm not going to try to answer it, but for something of this nature, you know, there are procedures that an action officer in a command center will check that he received a valid order. I mean, very few action officers actually are talking to the Vice President on the other end. So there is a procedure and a set of very specified directions so that you get a validated order. So you know you are under the authority of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States to take an action. I surmise that that wasn't in place. It was happening in such a chaotic way, and it just wasn't there. And people said, "Well, wait a minute, we didn't get X, Y, Z kind of a message from such and such." And they probably said, "Well, how do you know this is real?" I'm speculating here, sir, but we need to be. We know now that we have to be ready for this. We didn't have that consciousness on the 11th of September, and my guess is that they didn't follow a pre-designated format for authenticating a communication from the President of the United States. We know how to do that for nuclear war. We've never had that for an episode like this. And so before we just say that there was an egregious failure of duty, my guess is there are some operational details I need to understand better before I could jump to the conclusion and said that it was a dereliction of duty. I don't know that it's that yet.
I'm not suggesting that at all. I think people were individually responding, according to their own judgment. Certainly the Vice President was running the command post there and the like. But the fact that we weren't receiving the kind of incoming enemy attack that we thought we would be receiving in some other circumstances,
yes, sir.
Obviously is not.
I certainly understand your question, yes, sir.
The other point I would just make, because it leads to, and I don't out of time here, but due to I think the good graces of the chairman of the committee and his location of the National Airport in the state of Virginia, we're operating that with some risk to the Capitol, to the White House and the like. We had a situation with the governor of Kentucky, which has been largely overlooked by the Congress and by, I think, the powers that be in the last about 2 months ago, that says to me, if you look at the failure again of the communications, we evacuated this entire complex, a couple thousand people literally running for their lives out of the buildings, because of the failure again, and I can't get into this all, of the FAA to communicate with NORAD, to communicate, in this case, with the Capitol Police. So, you know, the axiom, what is condoned continues. Yes, we were caught very much by surprise on 9/11, but I see continuing evidence of the failure of these established procedures to be followed in a situation 2 months ago. Fortunately, it was the governor of Kentucky in a propeller plane rather than some other kind of attack. But it really alarms me. And Mr. Chairman, I just would submit, and I hope we can pursue this, because we can know all the intelligence reorganization and we can spend billions more or billions differently, but if we don't have basic lines of authority that we're going to follow in those situations of national emergency, I mean, it doesn't matter, frankly, how much we spend, it's going to fail again. Thank you.
Senator, point is well taken. The Senator's point is well taken. Dr. Schlesinger.
I can well understand why you were perturbed, but
Stunned.
but not astonished. You know, the order to shoot down a passenger airliner is met with a certain incredulity, and we were not prepared for this occasion. A fundamental point to bear in mind is we had a clear chain of command, and yet there was a failure. Reorganization is not going to solve that problem.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Dayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen. Mr. Secretary, the 9/11 Commission report, I'm quoting here on page 43, states, in most cases, the chain of command authorizing the use of force runs from the President to the Secretary of Defense, from the Secretary to the combatant commander. President Bush, because of, by his account and others, communications problems on board Air Force One that morning, was having difficulty establishing communication with the Vice President on a consistent basis. The Commission goes on to say here that the President spoke with you for the first time shortly after 10 o'clock, which would have been almost 2 hours after the first hijacking began. No one can recall the content of this conversation, but it was a brief call in which the subject of the shoot down of these incoming hijacked planes authority was not discussed. At 10:39, the Vice President updated you on the air threat. The Vice President was understandably under the belief that since he had communicated twice, possibly 3 times, according to this report, through a military aide to NORAD, the authority from the President to shoot down an incoming plane that did not detour, that was the instruction that had been passed on. The NORAD commander told the Commission, both the mission commander and the senior weapons director of NORAD indicated, and I'm quoting again the Commission report, they did not pass the order to the fighters circling Washington and New York because they were unsure how the pilots would or should proceed with this guidance. What is the necessary chain of command to be established so that an order directed from the President, verbally from the Vice President to NORAD, is carried out, or is communicated, I should say, to those who must carry it out?
Dick Myers and Dr. Cambone were with me that day. The way you've stated it is not the way I recall it, the 2-hour figure you used. My recollection is the first tower was hit sometime around 8:46, I think.
Sorry, I said the first hijacking commenced at 8:14.
Oh, the first hijacking, I beg your pardon.
You're right, though, about an hour and a half after the first plane.
Okay, I think the way to respond to this, Senator, is as follows. Under the way the national security arrangement is and was, I should say was, the responsibility of the Department of Defense was essentially to defend our country from external threats. Indeed, the responsibility for internal threats, which is obviously what was taking place on September 11th, not an external threat, it was from within the country, was the responsibility of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and in the case of a hijacked aircraft, the Federal Aviation Administration. And the responsibility of the Department of Defense was as a supporter of an attack on our country in the event we were asked. But the Congress and the country has for many decades kept the Department of Defense out of the law enforcement business, out of the crime business, out of internal law enforcement issues under the Posse Comitatus Act. So the Department of Defense was oriented externally. Our radars were pointing out, not in, and the FAA was the one that then had the responsibility to say there's a hijack, and then ask the Department of Defense, say, will you track and report on that hijacking? The hijacking traditionally being a situation where a plane is taken for the purpose of going someplace and then getting some political advantage for it, not flying it into a building. So the way you characterize the chain of command is correct, from the President to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commander, but it applied to things from external threats, not the responsibility of the FBI or the FAA.
I respect, sir, that the circumstances that morning were very different from what anybody had foreseen. Given, however, that the Vice President at that point from the command control bunker of the White House is communicating, again, I'm using the 9/11 Commission reports information here, is communicating via military aid to NORAD the President's verbal authority to shoot down a plane, and that information is not, that instruction is not communicated then to the fighter pilots circling the United States Capitol and the New York City. Is that the way it's supposed to function? Or would that happen again if we were to be surprised again today?
I'm going to have General Myers to add to this, but the answer is of course not. Since that day, a great many adjustments and changes have been made, and we have various types of fighter aircraft on alert. We have established a Assistant Secretary for Homeland Security in the Department of Defense. We have established a Northern Command that never existed for the Department of Defense to be addressing the Homeland Security issues from a Defense Department standpoint. We have a new Department of Homeland Security that exists. There's just a dozen things that are different. The way to stop airplanes is clearly from the ground. That is to say, to have air marshals and to have reinforced doors and to have baggage inspections and to not allow terrorists on aircraft that they can then take that aircraft and fly it into a building. Now, as a last resort, is it possible that we could shoot down an aircraft in the event that was necessary? Yes, it's possible. Airplanes fly right past the Pentagon every 5 minutes. And what it takes is simply to lower your nose and go into something. Could we stop that? No. I mean, the fact of the matter is that with all the airplanes flying around in the skies, it is not possible to do it in many instances. We do spend a lot of money and a lot of effort to try to stop it, both from the ground and from the air. And so the answer to your question is yes, a great deal has changed.
And my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. If I may just ask the...
Let's have General Myers.
Yes, sir. May I ask him also? All right, yes, sir.
Go ahead, Senator.
Senator Dayton, I would just add to the Secretary's remarks that now that NORAD is focused inward as well as externally, that there are rules of engagement that have been promulgated that are well understood. In a classified session or outside this room, we could talk about that if you want to, but they're very well understood up and down the chain of command, and it's practiced all the time. And clearly we're talking about some very serious issues here, as the Secretary said. It also involves ground defenses, not just air defenses. But the rules of engagement, the command and control structure that's set in there is completely different because the mission for NORAD changed after 9/11, and no longer were they asked to look just externally but also internally. And the relationship between NORAD and the Federal Aviation Administration has also changed dramatically, and we've worked those arrangements where we have, I think, very good communications today. And I talked to General Everhart today about that particular issue, and he certainly agrees.
Mr. Chairman, if I may just ask respond also, Mr. Chairman, if you would, in writing to the, I think it's inference, but it's also really an explicit accusation made in the substance of the report on particularly page 34, that NORAD's testimony 20 months after 9/11 to the 9/11 Commission about the sequence of events, particularly the failure of the FAA to inform NORAD on a timely basis of 3 of the 4 hijackings, was inaccurate. The statement made by NORAD publicly 1 week after 9/11, which is very similar to that testimony made 20 months later, was also inaccurate, seriously misleading anybody trying to assess the response and non-response that day in a way that I think is far more alarming about FAA's failure, proper response than NORAD's. But if you would please review that testimony and see, because I don't believe anybody has held those discrepancies, anyone to account for those discrepancies, and I consider them to be more than just oversights. I think they're serious misrepresentations of the facts. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Can I make just a comment on that, Senator Dayton? I'll liken this to an accident investigation board when an aircraft crashes. I've been reviewing officials or at the table at many of those. And normally what happens when an incident happens, there is the first report, which has some accuracies and many inaccuracies. And so statements, what people believe happened immediately afterwards and in the next week or 2 weeks, is what they believe. But as they continue to harvest the facts, and as we go to machines that record things like aircraft recorders, like radar scope recorders and so forth, the facts become clearer, and what people thought they saw or thought they understood or thought they heard changes over time. And that's the nature of these kind of investigations. I think NORAD would be the first to say that because of the access that the 9/11 Commission had to certain parts of this apparatus that was collecting this data, that it sharpened their focus too, and things they thought happened turned out to be either different or incomplete. And it took a lot of work and a lot of months to come to, what was ground truth. The same thing is true in accident investigations. It takes us sometimes many months to come to ground truth, and what people thought they heard, what they thought they saw, will be changed as they review the facts. And I think that's the case. I've talked to General Eberhard about this. I do not know what the motivation of NORAD would be to ever lie or deceive. I mean, that's not what they're pledged to do. They're pledged to do the same thing we all are in uniform, and that's defend this country. And I would take exception to anybody thinks that they had any other motive.
Thank you very much, General.
I just say, Mr. Chairman, this 20 months after this sworn testimony to the Commission, 20 months after the event, I think is worthy of your scrutiny, please. And furthermore, because, and I bring this up not just for historical reasons, 2 months ago, and if you have a chance to review the circumstances with the plane that caused the evacuation of the Capitol complex, with thousands of people running for their lives here, being informed to do so by the Capitol Police because of, again, a failure of the FAA, and almost entirely, based on the evidence I have, their failure to communicate just basic information to air defense, to anyone else, including the Capitol Police, that we had a situation there, the closest simulation I think we could possibly have, because people thought it was a real threat until they found out otherwise, that we could have. And here, 2.5 years after 9/11 has occurred, we find basically, again, a complete breakdown of communication by the federal authorities, and again, primarily FAA, but to National Defense Command and to others, so that we don't have a response. And, we talk about things not changing as a result of 9/11. This, to me, is the most horrific example that I could imagine. And if we don't deal with the fact that we failed now a second time on the basic elements of communication and following protocols and procedures.
Thank you.
No, sir, I've waited, sir, for 3 and 4 hours here.
Yeah, but
I just may finish.
cut out the time of other senators to be able to ask
Right.
a single
Yes,
question.
I have waited a long time,
I
sir.
ask your indulgence to supply it for the record, please, so that I can turn
Before 9/11 happens again, I was asked that we review that evidence. Thank you.
Senator Dayton, I'll respond to that for the record, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to
Senator,
have to ask respectfully that you provide, this is an important colloquy, but I've had senators waiting just as long. Senator Cornyn, it is your time. Please reply for the record, General.